Okay, so the final speaker is Dr. Mrinal Gounder, who's an oncologist who's going to be talking to us about bringing cures to von Willebrand disease. So welcome.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. So yes, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm a faculty at Memorial. I'm a medical oncologist, but today I'm here as a parent of a child with severe VWD, and I'm here as part of the VWD Connect Foundation, a patient advocacy group. So first I want to say on behalf of the VWD Connect Foundation, big thanks to the organization as well as the scientific committee for giving us an opportunity to discuss some of the work that we are doing in this space. It's a small organization, but we have big plans. So I have no financial disclosures, but the big disclosure is that I'm not a hematologist at all. So my personal journey in this story begins almost precisely 5 years ago today, when our younger son was born. And everything was fine. You know, we celebrated, our families were there, and my wife was still in the hospital. I went home, and she called me later that night, and she said, look, you know, they did a finger stick, and he just keeps bleeding. I don't quite understand what's going on. I said, I'm sure it's probably nothing. It'll be fine by tomorrow morning. But things were not fine. And, you know, a very astute nurse, as well as a resident, picked up that perhaps something is not right. They sent a battery of blood work. And by the next afternoon, just barely 24 hours after his birth, we were sitting with the chief of hematology. And he said, look, we've done a bunch of studies, and what it looks like is that your son probably has hemophilia. And at first we were just completely stunned, you know, just shocked and in disbelief. He said, it couldn't be, you know, we don't have any family history of any bleeding disorder, so this diagnosis is incorrect. Maybe you should do some more tests. But as we listened more, we started asking questions. Well, you know, how does this diagnosis made? How is it treated? And they went, you know, taught us about the management of hemophilia. But in that entire conversation, you know, what kind of stuck out to me was this, what they said is that, look, however bad things seem to you right now, that there are cures in hemophilia, and this is right around the horizon. And I personally had remembered reading these articles. I looked up in the New England Journal of Medicine. I said, yeah, you know, this is really exciting times for hemophilia. And I was, as much as we were frightened and shocked and saddened at that moment, there was room for optimism that perhaps, like, you know, in the next several years, things would be curable. But the following day, we met again with the chief hematologist, and he said, look, we ran several more tests, some more things came back, and we don't think your son has hemophilia. In fact, we think he has something called type 3 or severe 1 Willebrand deficiency. And, you know, I'd never heard of anything like this and vaguely remembered from medical school. So we started asking questions. And we said, well, you know, how many patients have you treated? He's like, well, at our large center, we only have one other patient. It's truly a very, very rare disease. And then you know, we asked more questions. You know, is this, how do you treat it? They said it's treated similar to hemophilia, but there's not a whole lot of prospective data to support that. And he says, well, do you transfuse? I mean, is it on-demand or prophylaxis? He says, well, it really depends whom you ask, and so on and so forth. And then we said, is there any research going on in this space? And he says, mostly basic science, not a whole lot of translational research. And is anybody working on a cure? And the answer was no. And what is the prognosis for a child with severe VWD? And they said, truthfully, we're not sure. So that was a really tough day. And so we went home that night and we were discharged. And, my wife, she's also a gastroenterologist, and she said, you know what, I had a co-resident in my residency program, a really brilliant scientist. He had hemophilia. I think I'm going to reach out to him and see how he's doing. I'm sure he'll give us great ideas. So she looked and she searched, and this is what she found. Her co-resident at Stanford had had passed away just a year ago from hemophilia. So this was, one devastating news after another in a span of 72 hours. That entire year was, I think, for me, as well as for my wife, a really, really tough time. We were facing an enormous amount of uncertainties, and we were both physicians living in New York City, working as academic physicians, and we really didn't have any answers at all. And it was very hard to wonder what our son's life would look like. But even in those moments, what sort of kept me going was in this memoriam written in CCR, that even in your most difficult time, Holbrook had said, do your best to overcome obstacles. So that sort of kept going. But personally, for both of us, what was the light at the end of the tunnel was finding this VWD Connect Foundation. Unbeknownst to us, at the same year that our son was born, this foundation had started. And Ed Kubler, as well as Jeanette Sesta, who are both here in the audience. Jeanette Sesta is a patient who, after many years, felt it was time to start an organization to address the needs of the severe VWD patients. And that was the second conference that I had attended, and we attended. And as soon as we saw these patients who are of all ages, it was such a tremendous amount of relief for us. And I think for the first time in a year, I actually was able to sleep. But what Jeanette was doing was something very interesting, that she had close to 100 patients with severe VWD under one roof, and providing, of course, a lot of support, but also asking them a lot of questions using these ARS question banks. And what she was doing is, and she's a chartered accountant, not a scientist or a researcher, but writing up all of this as part of abstracts and posters and presenting them all over the world. And I sat down with Jeanette and said, this is really fantastic. I mean, here's a poster on the bleeding disorder in women with severe VWD. And I said, this is outstanding. But I also recognize as a scientist that this is not the most rigorous way to do science, or this could not really be used for regulatory purposes. So I sat down with her that same meeting, within 24 hours of coming to this thing, and I hounded her down and said, look, we've got to do research. We have to move this needle forward in severe VWD. And I said, this gene and this disease was described in 1926. It's almost 100 years later. What are we doing really to move this in a transformational way? And she said, look, there's 100 patients in that thing right now. It's an enormous amount of time and effort to take care of them. We are a small organization. We really can't take on this research. It's a whole another, it's a big headache. I'm not sure we could do this. And I sat down with Ed and Jeanette and said, let me tell you a story. And this happened about 10 or 15 years ago when I was still a fellow. and when I was a fellow in the sarcoma clinic, I came across these desmoid tumors, which are ultra-rare cancers as well, basically 3 per million. And these are tumors that basically occur anywhere from head to toe, and we treat them with cytotoxic chemotherapies, and they're really a nasty tumor to deal with. So I came across this 35-year-old man who had basically failed all lines of therapy, and the only thing he was facing was a 4-quarter amputation. At the same time, I had sort of read that there was possibly VEGF inhibition of these tumors may be useful. So there was this drug called sorafenib, which had already been FDA approved, both for renal as well as liver cancer. We said, why don't we give it a try? What do we have to lose? And we did. And this patient had a complete response to this drug. So went on to treat another 25 patients with this, and all had tremendous outcomes, published it in Clinical Cancer Research. I was very proud of myself. I patted myself on the back. As a fellow, I got a nice paper. This went on to NCCN guidelines. But this is when I met these two women, Marlene and Jeannie, from the Desmoid Tumor Research Foundation. They said, look, we read your paper. It's really exciting. We want you to tell us, how can we get this FDA approved? Can you use this drug now through the FDA? I said, no, this is a retrospective study, and this is really nothing more than that. They said, well, but we really want to get this. Our patients can't get access to this drug. Insurance will not cover it. What do we have to do to move this forward? And I said, look, the only way we could do this, and this is their organization, I said, the only way we could do this is if we do a randomized study or we did a prospective controlled study. They said, why don't you do that? I said, because everybody in our field saying that it's absolutely not sensible to do that at all. In fact, in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the chairman at MD Anderson had really doubted on the wisdom of doing a randomized study in such a rare disease. But regardless, we pressed forward. We ran this phase 3 study, and people said, you're not going to find the patients. They're extremely rare to come by. But we beat expectations of accrual. The study, with the help of the patient advocacy group, accrued in record time. The study met its primary endpoint of improvement in progression-free survival. We were thrilled that it was accepted in the New England Journal of Medicine, and right now it is basically, sorafenib has become the global first-line standard in this disease. More importantly, there was one single speaker in 2007. 10 years later, there are 50 research experts and researchers studying desmoid tumors, and now we have at least 3 or 4 different pharmaceutical companies all rushing into this space to do pivotal studies to get their new drugs approved. So when I sat down with Jeanette and Ed, I said, look, what's the most important thing people generally think is funding, but far more important is to build critical mass. And you already have critical mass of patients here. We need to build a next step of critical mass so that we can start thinking out of box thinking and then move it forward. Funding will come sooner than later. So what we did is we were extraordinarily lucky to get some of the brightest people working in VWD to join the Medical and Scientific Advisory Board. And these are people in North America, Europe, Middle East, as well as in Africa. So when we got together and we said, what are we going to do? What is the transformative, how should the foundation invest its funds towards? The first response was, the immediate reason was like, well, we should do, invest in basic science. We should get postdocs and stuff, maybe work on this. And then we had this intellectual hypothetical exercise. Well, let's imagine we did come up with a CRISPR, or we came up with something else that was a transformative drug in our hand. What would next steps look like? And we recognized one thing, is that drug development is absolutely dependent on industry, and it's driven by industry as well as a conversation with the regulatory bodies. And the first question they would ask is, well, tell us about your disease. What is the prevalence? What is the natural history? Does everybody need to be treated? If so, how long? What does the current treatment paradigm look like? Is this new drug safer? Is it, what would be the trial endpoints? What would your trial design look like? Would you do a single arm? Would you do randomized? And so on and so forth. And we realized at that moment that we actually knew none of the answers at all. And we recognized immediately that hemophilia is not severe VWD. The endpoints that we're using there, maybe we could use it, but we certainly can't apply it there. So we decided that what we needed to do was to basically start with the building blocks, which is to start with the natural history and link it with the pathobiology of this disease itself. This would then inform us about the trial endpoints as well as a biomarker-driven patient selection, which would ultimately inform us about trial design for a pivotal study. So to do this, we tasked 3 of the people are sitting right here to do a natural history study in severe VWD. 2 of them are patients who have full-time jobs. They also happen to have background in data science as well as in clinical trials management. And then Stephanie, who's right here, is an expert in genetics. So when they finished in their evenings and night times, they wrote this protocol, which is basically a patient-driven protocol. So I think the first question we asked is, why are we duplicating this effort? Ath9 has been open. It's already doing this. Why should we, basically duplicate these efforts? And this is run by Dr. Robert Sidonia, who's the leading expert in this space, and luckily for us is also on our medical and scientific advisory board. But there were a couple of deficiencies in the Ath9 study that we were hoping that perhaps from a patient advocacy perspective, we could address. The most important thing is that the Ath9 study is only open in the HTC centers, and only 15% of the HTC centers are participating in this. And this is very much a patient, physician, and a healthcare-driven process, and the data is entered by healthcare physicians at the time at which the patients arrive at the HTC centers. And we recognize that if we change this paradigm and we make it into a patient-powered, different natural history study, where we are geographically unconstrained, that patients living anywhere, whether you're close to an HTC center or not, whether you get their care there, whether you partially get there, it really doesn't matter, that every single patient in the United States can enter their information into this system. So the other important thing is that the regulatory burden on the patient on this is also much faster. So we are able to amend the protocol much faster and move on to change the modules as needed. So there's key things over here. One is this is not entirely a patient-powered thing. Every information that is entered into the database is also verified by the principal investigators, and the source is verified with the medical records that it's submitted to make sure that the data is really, in fact, correct. And then this is subsequently reviewed by the medical scientific expert panel to make sure that the information that's entered into the data analysis is also accurate. So the question is, are we really making a difference? Is this a better approach? And there was a paper just published in one of the Cell journals looking in a very rare disease known as Castleman's disease. And this is also done by another patient who had Castleman's disease, who's a physician as well, and basically showed that the amount of data and the quality of data is superior when it is patient-driven rather than a physician-driven traditional approach. So this is what the website looks like. Patients enter it, they sign their consents, they release medical records, they fill out a whole different bunch of modules, and when that is done, new modules are put in place. And this is just a little bit of a teaser from the data. We opened this was IRB approved in August, we opened it in December, and a handful of patients joined, and as you can see here, we're already getting information about the demand, prophylaxis, the type of bleeding, where it bleeds from based on gender and things like that. And more of the information will come at ISTH. So I had also mentioned that we're also collecting blood for genetic studies as well as for plasma studies itself. So how do you collect blood for a patient who is not part of an HTC in this new model? And for this, we partnered with an organization known as Pattern.org. Pattern.org is really set up as a rare cancer initiative where the idea is that any patient with cancer living anywhere in the United States can voluntarily submit their tumor tissue to say the Broad Institute or Memorial Sloan Kettering to study that to a lab. They can designate this, especially has been profoundly impactful in rare diseases. So we worked with them, and they actually changed their charter to include VWD and rare diseases instead of just rare cancers to work with us. So basically what happens is, if you imagine there's a patient who's living in Hawaii, they sign an online consent through Pattern.org, and Pattern.org sends a kit through which they can basically go to a local phlebotomist, they process it in a certain way, and that kit is then sent to the Blood Center of Wisconsin at Versity. And Stephanie has really sort of helped with this entire process of all the different levels of VW to check, as well as DNA extraction and storage and biobanking for current data analysis, as well as for future as well. So this is sort of our big roadmap, and I'm going to stop in just a second. The last part is we also recognize that quality of life, Peter Lenting had mentioned yesterday, is very essential. So in our third module, we're building quality of life questionnaires to patients. And these are all standard, well-known quality of life questionnaires. But what we're hoping to do is to take these quality of life questionnaires and then build a dedicated disease-specific patient-reported outcomes measure instrument to eventually embed into future clinical trials. So with that, I want to thank you for bringing attention to VWD and giving us the podium. And I also want to wish my son a birthday. Happy birthday. It's a bright future for him. Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you for sharing the story with us. I think we have time for one or possibly two comments or questions.
Len Valentino from the National Hemophilia Foundation. So I think this is the kind of inspiration that we need to really be able to bring communities together. It's innovative, it's a unique way to do this, and most importantly, it's driven by the patient community. And I think this is really what's critical to move all of these fields forward, especially in rare blood diseases. So thank you for your work, thank you for pulling this off, and really bringing what you know from the cancer field into our field. It's a great accomplishment, so thank you.